In our last lecture, we ended by looking at purchasing power parity and the idea that if you allowed a free working international market, prices of comparable goods would equilibrate internationally when measured in a common currency. So the price of cars in the United States will equalize with the price of cars in Britain. And in theory, that works. But in reality, it's kind of hard to say whether purchasing power parity exists or not. Attempts to measure purchasing power parity have been inconsistent. We don't see that it always works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's not consistent. And there are a couple of reasons why it may not work. And the first is that there are other factors that are influencing prices, and those include interest rates, income levels, the amount of government control there is. So the market is not a pure free working market. There are other things that are influencing there. And so hard to tell about purchasing power parity. The other reason why it's inconsistent, our results are inconsistent, is that there may or may not be a substitute for the good we're looking at. Domestically, internationally, the goods may be sufficiently different that consumers don't see them as the same. And so demand may not change the way it needs to. Inflation's another thing that comes in here. So unfortunately, while purchasing power parity is a great theory, we're not really seeing it empirically. So the one other thing, we've looked at interest rates and do they equalize from one country to another? Do prices equalize from one country to another? The other thing is that we need to look at is exchange rates. How do they change? And again, this is a very important question because exchange rates will determine whether or not you're going to go into the market, right? We've looked at that arbitrage stuff. So when we look at exchange rates, again, what we need to first look at is the nominal exchange rate. That is the exchange rate you get quoted. All right. But there's also a real exchange rate. Now, remember, whenever you see an economic term that is labeled real means that there's been some type of statistical adjustment that goes on. And usually the adjustment is for inflation, where we try to factor out the effects of inflation. In your macro class, you probably talked about real GDP. Again, another measure in which we're taking out the effects of inflation. Now, there's another theory that we need to look at, and that's the international Fisher effect. And what this says is that interest rates explain why exchange rates change over time. That our nominal interest rate will equal the rate of return plus anticipated inflation. So exchange rates, inflation rates, all kind of merge here. They're all together. If investors worldwide require the same amount of real return, then differences in interest rates will result in inflation. It will result in money moving and inflation occurring. So if we were to draw a graph very similar to the one we looked at in our previous lecture, the one for interest rate parity, if we constructed something similar to that for the Fisher effect, we would see that there is going to be, along that 45-degree line, a balance between that interest rates would balance out, and that will then balance out exchange rates. So all of these things, interest rates, prices, exchange rates, they all feed in on each other and become complicating factors in us trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future. All right. So what we need to move on to is looking at a way that we can forecast, that we can predict what's going to be happening in the future. Because we need to understand how are interest rates going to change, how are prices going to change, how are exchange rates going to change, because these things will determine whether we're investing domestically, whether we're investing internationally, how much do we need to hedge, all of that stuff. So next week, we're going to begin looking at forecasting.